Well, welcome everyone to stream 3 of today for our presentation. We have 3 different groups participating today. We are going to go in the order that they are in the program. Each speaker will have 10 minutes in order to present their material, and we'll wait and have questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So we'll go ahead and get started with our first group. I'm going to let them introduce themselves.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate it. My name is Carlena Orosco, and I, along with my co-presenter today, Victor Mora, will be discussing the don't zone, the qualitative analysis of officer behaviors that hinder effective de-escalation. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to my co-presenter, Victor.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So the current presentation is part of a larger project with the Tempe Police Department. In 2018, the Tempe PD received a grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance through its Strategies for Innovation program. We, the presenters, serve as the research partner on the project, which seeks to design, deliver, and evaluate a newly created de-escalation training program. More specifically, Tempe PD designed its own de-escalation training by drawing on components of other de-escalation and related training, as well as the local expertise of the officers in the department. So far, it has been delivered to half of the patrol force via a randomized control trial. And we are still in the process of collecting and analyzing data to evaluate the impact of the training on key components or key outcomes, such as use of force, complaints, injuries, citizen perceptions, and officer perceptions. There were several key elements that helped inform the de-escalation curriculum. Initially, we needed to identify principles of de-escalation. So we sent officers to several trainings locally and nationally, and they reviewed each training they attended. We also used the peer nomination process to identify 14 officers that were considered excellent at de-escalation by their peers. And we did ride-alongs, interviews, and focus groups with these 14 officers. We reviewed the prior literature on the topic, and we also have administered 3 waves of an officer perception survey, which is where today's findings are coming from. So we did 2 waves of the officer perception survey prior to the training, and a wave after the training has been delivered. The survey includes over 100 questions that capture their attitudes on a wide range of issues, most notably the tactics they use to de-escalate encounters and perceptions about de-escalation training. The survey also captures their likelihood of using force, some procedural justice items, and demographic characteristics as well. But today, we're excited to present some qualitative findings from this survey. Much of the conversation surrounding de-escalation has been focused on what an officer should do to de-escalate an encounter with a citizen. But I think we stand to benefit by getting the officer's perspective on tactics or behaviors they should avoid in order to prevent an interaction from escalating. So this presentation focuses on the qualitative results we got from question 50 of our survey, which is what types of behaviors should an officer avoid using in a citizen encounter? And that's where Carlena will pick up.
Thank you so much, Victor. So this leads us to, as a sergeant working on the project states, the don't zone, which is the place that you don't want to be as an officer. And so that's essentially behaviors and tactics that may hinder effective de-escalation. So through a process of inductive coding, we analyzed the qualitative responses from question 50 and arrived at 4 overall themes. These are communication, physical demeanor, tactics, and emotional responses. So wave 1, this is the analysis and basically the first wave of those qualitative responses that we analyzed. So for communication, for the sake of time, I'll just highlight a few. This could be speaking in a condescending, belittling, or demeaning manner, also shouting, using vulgar language, being aggressive or combative in your language, being rude or having a bad attitude, and what I find really interesting, listening to respond, not listening to understand. As far as physical demeanor, this includes having rigid body language or appearing unapproachable, wearing sunglasses, which is rather interesting because that kind of leads to an impersonal interaction. Of course, using excessive force and running or using those type of aggressive gestures if unnecessary. Finally, when it comes to tactics, a lack of situational awareness, entering the situation already escalated, very interesting. So kind of coming in already a little bit amped up or a little excited because of the nature of the call. Uh, Also appearing too relaxed or being indecisive in your actions and acting without explaining. This was really emphasized in the responses in terms of being transparent and explaining why you are engaging in certain behaviors. Then finally, emotional includes not remaining calm or controlled, not being aware of what upsets you or your triggers, being too invested emotionally and taking things personally, as well as acting through your ego or impulsively or having no empathy. So those are just some of the behaviors that responses included. So the pre-training wave, I added those, you'll see in bright yellow. These are some new additions or new behaviors or tactics that emerged from the second wave of responses. So we see with communication that includes arrogant, being sarcastic, acting in a disinterested, indifferent, or dismissive manner, being antagonistic. As far as physical demeanor, having an intimidating posture, which could also relate to rigid body language, rolling your eyes. For tactics, rushing or cutting corners was really emphasized in the responses that officers need to take their time to really adapt to the situation and respond appropriately without rushing. Finally, having a lack of command presence, which could go to a lack of confidence. And finally, repeating commands and expecting different results. And this goes to the adaptability and the dynamic nature of these interactions. Finally, for emotional responses, getting sucked in. Again, this leads to not being aware of what upsets you or awareness of your triggers. And finally, acting out of stereotypes. So for the post-training or wave 3 of the survey, those are in pinkish red color, and these are new behaviors that emerged in the qualitative responses on top of what we've already seen in the prior 2 waves. So sounding robotic, your tone, also minimizing the citizens' concerns or minimizing the interaction, acting in a type of bullying or engaging in bullying behavior, provoking the citizen. And I found very interesting tit for tat, meaning feeling you have to one up the citizen throughout the interaction. And finally, just being unprofessional. As far as physical demeanor, there were no new behaviors or tactics that emerged in the post-training responses. For tactics, showing physical weakness. And finally, for emotional responses, not caring or acting in a demoralizing way, having judgment or entering with racist views or judgmental views, being immature, and mental weakness. So these are some quotes, direct responses taken from those qualitative question 50 responses that we found very interesting. And I'll just highlight a few for the sake of time. So one on the right side, showing up with no patience to hear out all parties and to understand that people don't hate you personally. They don't know you, so don't take offense. And this goes to, again, just adapting to the situation and understanding that people are having a negative experience, potentially a traumatic experience. It's not a personal attack. Feeling that they have to win every contact by getting in the last word or by somehow reinforcing that they are in control or superior. Sometimes you just need to shut up and walk away to truly win. This was a central theme of the de-escalation training, was being able to identify when the interaction is not going in a positive direction and you need to tap out, or perhaps
Pardon the interruption, you have 2 minutes left.
Thank you. Or perhaps having to transfer the incident to someone else. That was really a central theme of the training. And so we were happy to see this response, recognizing that sometimes you need to walk away. Then finally, just one other quote, depends on the encounter. No 2 encounters are the same. Again, another central component of the training was to be adaptable and understand that these situations are very dynamic and you need to be flexible in your response. So there are many implications for this research. First, it contributes to our limited understanding of what doesn't work in de-escalation. Again, it requires the ability to adapt depending on the situation. Because there's a lack of evaluations on the effectiveness of de-escalation training, understanding the tactics from the field that may not be particularly beneficial can help us in shaping future training. And finally, there's a continued emphasis on verbal and nonverbal communication. So just for some next steps, we plan on further analyzing this data, looking at our treatment and control groups in terms of the training to see if there were different responses for those groups in particular. So thank you so much for your time, and we're excited for the end of the presentations to hear any questions you might have. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. The next presenter, you can go ahead and share your screen. Those who are attending as participants, feel free to add questions in the Q&A located at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer those at the end of the webinar, at the end of the presentation.
Hi, let me share. All right. Hi, my name is Vrishali Kanvinde. I just finished my PhD from UT Dallas, and this is one of the questions out of my dissertation where I looked at control balance theory and cynicism and officer behavior. So here I'm looking at the impact of cynical attitudes on misconduct behavior. So cynicism is a concept that comes to us mostly from organizational and industrial psychology, especially in the context of workplace cynicism, which is essentially what police cynicism is when we see policing as, a job. So cynicism itself is a negative affect that's characterized by feelings of frustration, apathy, or general malaise towards society or towards a particular function of society. In a workplace context, this can lead to job burnout stemming from mistrust in coworkers and perceived unfairness from management, or in the context of policing, from command staff. Police cynicism can be caused by a number of factors, with the prevailing theory being that there's a disconnect between the idealized police as a crime fighter and the day-to-day reality of the job, causing officers to feel frustrated and apathetic towards the police organization and the general public. So this is especially prevalent in the post-reform era, so beginning in the 1930s, when the increasing professionalism and bureaucracy in the police organization led to officers acting under more of a social work umbrella, often as a liaison between the general public and social service agencies, rather than, chasing criminals, stopping crime, catching bad guys. So this led to feelings of anomie, and then cynicism becomes a response to anomie. It's measured in police first through the Niederhofer scale, which was developed in 1967 and then refined or modified in 1976 by Rigoli, which is what I'm using in this study. So I'm looking at the impact of cynicism on police behavior, with the hypothesis that officers who report more cynical attitudes will have a higher likelihood of reporting violations of the department disciplinary code. So I'm using Rigoli's modified version of the Niederhofer cynicism scale, which is a 20-item Likert scale that assesses the respondents' agreements with statements concerning policing, both towards relations with the public, as a profession and as an organization, with higher total values indicating lower cynical attitudes, and then lower values indicating higher cynical attitudes. Then these items are further divided into dimensions or subscales of cynicism, which include cynicism towards relation with the public, dedication to duty, cynicism towards social solidarity, toward the police organization, and toward police training and education. My misconduct variables were operationalized as either complaints against the officer, which can be from a member of the public or a fellow officer, or violations of the disciplinary code, which include neglect of duty, conduct unbecoming, intoxication, insubordination, or disobedience of order. I also looked at use of force and whether that use of force was counted unjustified. My data came from the Philadelphia police survey that was done by Jack Green, Alex Picaro, Brian Lawton, and Matt Hickman in the late 1990s, which had a sample of 499 Philadelphia police officers, majority of them being patrol officers with a couple of sergeants, detectives, and lieutenants thrown in. So I wanted to jump right into results. So I looked at First, the impact of the total cynicism on formal complaints, and I found that officers with a lower cynicism score, which remember indicates higher cynical attitudes, are more likely to report that they were ever the subject of a formal complaint by a citizen, as well as more likely to report a higher number of total complaints. I then split this into Rigoli's dimensions of cynicism and looked at the formal complaints and found that officers reporting more cynicism towards the police organization, towards dedication to duty, and towards social solidarity were more likely to report any complaints from a citizen, as well as higher numbers of total complaints. Additionally, officers reporting more cynical attitudes were more likely to report disciplinary code charges of conduct unbecoming and insubordination. However, cynicism did not appear to have a significant relationship with whether or not the officers had any disciplinary code charges. Dividing this into Rigoli's dimensions, reporting higher levels of cynicism toward the police organization indicated a higher likelihood of ever being charged with a violation of the disciplinary code, as well as that charge being neglect of duty. Reporting higher cynicism toward the public indicated a higher likelihood of being charged with disobedience of order. Then looking at use of force, higher officers who reported higher levels of cynicism seem to have a significant relationship with the likelihood of ever being involved in a use of force incident, but it's important to note that there was no significant relationship between cynicism and the frequency of use of force incidents, or whether or not the use of force was ever ruled unjustified. So then again, I split that into Rigoli's dimensions of cynicism and found that cynicism toward the police organization had a significant relationship with ever being involved in a use of force incident, the frequency of use of force incidents, and the likelihood of these incidents being found to be unjustified. So, going back to the research question, does cynicism impact officer behavior? Well, yeah. It's fair to say that cynicism has an impact on officer behavior, specifically that higher reported levels of cynicism toward the police organization has the widest impact on disciplinary code violation charges. So this did have significant limitations. The first being that the data was collected in the late 1990s. A couple things have happened in the past 20 years where it's a safe bet to say that if we collected this data again, we might see different levels of cynicism in officers now. The dependent variables were coded dichotomously as like a have you ever question without considering a temporal aspect. So for example, an officer who maybe was a year into their career and had 3 disciplinary code charges was coded the same as an officer who had 3 charges over a 30-year career. And then finally, the dependent variable measured official charges only. So intoxication was one of the potential charges. No officer reported intoxication charges. So that doesn't mean that, none of those 499 officers ever, or that none of the 490 officers ever touched alcohol. It just means that they never did on the job, or if they did, they weren't caught, or if they were caught, charges weren't filed. So it'd be interesting to replicate this study, but to include off-duty behavior. So what? Implications of these findings are primarily focused on police-community relations and police legitimacy. So officers with negative attitudes towards the police organization and command staff are more likely to have a high number of complaints filed against them by citizens, which negatively impacts police community relations and perceptions of police legitimacy. So communities with negative attitudes towards the police see officers as an outside force or an occupying force rather than an integral part of the community, which decreases the likelihood of cooperation and the efficacy of community-based crime prevention efforts. So we can apply this research by potentially deploying the survey again to police departments and finding sources of cynicism among officers and figuring out how to mitigate cynicism among officers, either through training or through mindfulness programs or other wellness programs that address mental health in both officers and the community. And there's my contact information if you feel like cyberbullying me. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And again, remember, we're saving questions to the very end. We'll get to those. We will have time to do that. So if you have a question, go ahead and write it into the Q&A box. I'll be happy to facilitate that with the group. We're going to have our last presenter now. And you're ready to go.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Sarah Trocchio. I'm an assistant professor at Rider University in New Jersey. I'm going to be talking about power and prescience, how we assess city officials' prior support for sweeping police reform. And this is a project that grew out of my dissertation data as well. So I'll spend just a little bit of time talking through how I got to today and sort of where I hope to go after that. So the first research questions really center around perspectives of policing policy from local officials. So the first being, how did local officials in 3 cities in the United States assess the role of the police in 2018? And to what extent, if any, did such rhetoric foreshadow support for defunding or abolition? And then how much divergence or alignment in visions of policing were represented in those cities through official statements or policing policy following George Floyd's murder in May 2020. So just to give you a bit of background, we know that we've seen increasing data on how we understand the scope of the problem of unethical policing, in particular use of force. We've had wonderful recent research come out from Frank Edwards and colleagues from last year, for instance, showing that police use of force is a leading cause of death among young men, in particular young men of color, often unjustified use of force per the actual police department's reporting on such patterns. And we know as well that 2020 was a unique year of reckoning with respect to police and community relations and police use of force. George Floyd, as you likely know, was murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis, just a few blocks from where my sister lives, actually, on May 25th for allegedly using a counterfeit bill in a store. What we saw after that in the aftermath of sort of the first round of lockdowns was a great awakening in our country and our cities around the issue of police brutality again. And so sort of the traditional ways that we have interpreted unjustified police violence center around discussions of ethics and corruption. If you followed the news cycles following George Floyd and others being killed at the hands of the police, we hear these phrases turned around a lot, right? Bad apples, it was a bad apple, or it was a rotten pocket, a small group of police officers who were acting unethically, and that led to the unjustified use of force. But what we've seen in 2020 in particular, as we've been captivated by George Floyd and the events that followed, as well as sort of being at home and being tuned in more so, is this sense that we're reckoning with this legacy, this unique, painful American legacy, which Nicole Hannah-Jones says really well. The killings of Black men and women at the hands of the state with no justice is among the oldest and most familiar American stories. So I won't stay on this image for too long, but all the way on the left, we have a slave patrol image dating back from the 18th century in the South, and a number of high profile deaths of civilians that have occurred since then. And so what we've seen as there's been a reckoning since the summer in particular is that we're more likely to rely on and to use critical interpretations of policing that move away from this idea of bad apples or rotten corners, for instance, and instead talk about this idea that the function of policing as it has existed in the United States has been to support the power, privilege, and property of whites, and in turn also to control and dehumanize Black bodies, and to a lesser extent, other non-white groups. And so we've had this awakening in which we've tried to consider, well, what should become of the police? And it's been a rather quick awakening in many circles. And so we have spent a lot of time talking about police reform previously, right? So this idea that we might want to have more or different policing, but better policing. So like the first presentation, how do we approach de-escalation? What does that look like? But then, of course, you're likely familiar with these other models that have become more popular in recent months. So this idea of defunding. So we're going to have less policing. We're going to disinvest from policing, but it will be better policing because we'll have social service agencies and other institutions step in and do the role of non-criminal management of behavior and assistance of people. And then, of course, we have abolishment, which is this idea that the institution of policing writ large cannot and can never be trusted. And instead, we need to completely scrap it and start from the beginning and overhaul the system entirely. So when we're thinking about what is going to become of the police, we have to center our focus around local policy in particular. And that's because policing in the United States is incredibly fragmented and highly localized. When we're talking about things like police use of force, ultimately we have to look to the municipalities in which those things occurred. And also because local policing budgets make up a lion's share of most municipal budgets. And so they are open for discussion and dialogue right now. So what I want to do now is just tell you very briefly about sort of what my dissertation study as a whole was about. I looked at 2 time periods. I was curious to see how low-level crime legislation had evolved or failed to evolve since the 1990s. In particular, I was interested in looking at 70 cities and seeing how racialized language, so language that was ostensibly race neutral, but had the impact of targeting non-whites, had evolved over time. I did some quantitative analyses to assess what kind of aggregate associations might occur between city level factors and the presence or absence of that language. And then the last piece of my dissertation was focused on using some qualitative methods to understand the local processes that undergird policing policy. And so that's the focus of this exploration today. And so I had 3 purposely sampled case study sites from those 70 cities that I used in my entire dissertation. And the names are not super relevant, but they're just pseudonyms to help us keep them clear and distinct. They're from different regions in the country, relatively similar sizes. And I conducted 13 phone interviews in 2018, so just about 2 years ago, with local officials in each site. And I also triangulated some of that phone interview data with other kinds of data like news coverage, enforcement data, lawsuits, and resolutions that were passed in those cities from 2018 and 2020. Just to give you a very brief sense of who these people were that I spoke to, mostly half of them were city council members or high-ranking city council aides. There were others that were city attorneys, police department, high-ranking officials, so leadership, or police review commission leaders as well. The sample of those phone interview respondents was about half non-white and predominantly male. And so what I was really interested in since this summer was trying to figure out, how did these local officials talk about policing? Were they foreshadowing sort of these trends to come? And if not, maybe why that didn't happen. And if not, what was happening in those cities now? So what was really interesting was there were really common themes, unlike other topics in my dissertation, very common themes that coalesced around each respondent, regardless of their particular role in the city that they served in, their demographics, their gender, et cetera. And most respondents, while expressing a very strong adherence to progressive values and a commitment to addressing entrenched racial inequities, were not interested in trying to reimagine the role of the police. Instead, they were okay saying the police are ultimate power holders. Their job is to manage and respond to local issues. And so in particular, defunding as a concept was completely absent from city officials' rhetoric in late 2018. So again, you have this acknowledgement of structural antecedents of crime. You have an acknowledgement of the racialized history of policing, of the way that policing is still racialized, but respondents really stopped short of supporting defunding or redistribution of resources away from the police.
There are 2 minutes left.
And so I won't read you these quotes, but you can see that there is this idea that people are acknowledging what is happening with respect to structural inequities, but basically saying that some of the ways you fix those are for things through like a new program or more policing, for instance. And so again, we see this idea that the antidote to the problems that cities had seen was not to divest from police departments, but instead to return to this old faithful idea of community policing, right? So this idea that we should accept rather than challenge the idea that police have social service obligations, right? They should still sit at the nexus of problem and solution identification, right? And so the idea from local leaders was we should invest in particular policing strategies rather than even focus on the redistribution of resources. So this idea here about a new police chief coming in and saying, you know, we're just trying to help engage the public and really helping the public deal with whatever the issue is, whether it's actually a police related issue or not. And so finally, we didn't see not just a lack of interest in divestment, but actually an articulated commitment to consistent investment in the police, right? So this common refrain that police need adequate funding, that a lot of what folks work on is making sure that the police have enough funding, not that there should ever be funding taken away. And so what's been really interesting is despite the similarities in all of this across the 3 case study sites in 2018, just 2 years later, we see quite a bit of divergence in the way that city councils and mayors in these case study sites, have responded. And so in Consistent City, we're seeing a pretty sweeping effort at defunding and de-investing from the police. The mayor vetoed subsequent cuts beyond initial cuts that were made this summer, but the city council has been very supportive. In Novel Userville, we've already seen reductions in the budget for the police department and apparently 120 proposed positions to be cut, while in the 3rd case study site, neither the city council or the mayor has supported any of this. So just to wrap up.
We're going to have to stop there. If anyone would like to have more information on this study from Sarah, they can contact her directly, as we are sticking to our strict 10-minute presentation time during the conference. We do have some questions. If anyone wants to add a few more questions, feel free to do so. The first question is for our first panelist. The question is, regarding the don't zone, very interesting qualitative take on de-escalation. I likely missed it, but are your findings from police officers or first line supervisors?
Hi, Marilyn. Thanks for your question. So our officer perception survey was delivered to all of patrol force. So both line level officers and supervisory level officers were included in that.
Great. And then we have a couple questions for our second panelist. The question is, do you think police departments can determine the amount of cynicism a potential applicant has towards the profession before they hire them? Maybe help curb some of the officers with this mentality, or is this something you can only, only you can determine once they are hired and in uniform?
So it depends. So when Niederhofer started looking at police cynicism in the late 60s, early 70s, he suggested that cynicism in officers has a couple of different causal paths. The first one being that it develops through on the job through socialization. So more experienced officers or field training officers impart attitudes and perspectives on newer officers, which, you know, these attitudes can be cynicism, and newer officers learn that, and so the cycle continues. Or that just a certain type of person who happens to be more cynical self-selects into policing as a field. That second one we could potentially screen for during a psych eval prior to being hired. The second one is more difficult to determine. Yeah. It's entirely possible. It's just the type of questions we'd have to ask during, you know, an evaluation prior to hiring.
And another question for you as well. Do you think the involvement in these situations could have been what increased their cynicism? Do you think that the causation could have gone the opposite way? We had a couple questions about the causation going the opposite way.
Yeah, so the causal mechanisms of cynicism could go either way for sure. Some research shows that there is a curvilinear relationship between an officer's career length and cynicism. So, you know, the brand new officers come in with very low levels of cynicism. It peaks around like 5 to 10 years on the job, and then it drops off, with the theory being that once they're promoted up higher enough, or promoted high enough, they don't feel cynical towards the job anymore because they have, the power to make whatever changes they need to make. We can't rule out that we could look at the causation better if the data set were different. So this is secondary data. I didn't collect this data. This is cross-sectional, so it just looks at their cynicism at that point in time where they were surveyed. However, if we did like a panel study where we checked in, or a more longitudinal study where we, checked in with the officers every couple of years to assess, their self-reported cynicism, and then we looked at the incidents they were involved in or the complaints against them, we could establish that causal chain a little better. But right now, it hasn't really been determined.
And one more question for you. Might more research on this potentially facilitate change in police culture?
Yeah, making police departments aware of cynicism could help facilitate, programming within departments to mitigate that. So I read literally yesterday, Arlington PD here in Texas launched like a physical fitness and mental wellness program to help their officers. And different departments could adopt something similar to, one, make their officers aware of how to recognize when they're feeling cynical and then give them coping mechanisms to mitigate cynicism.
Just as an interesting side note, I actually work on using virtual reality as a way to do mindfulness and meditation for that types of purposes. Just a side note. All right, this message is for our first group. How does the Tempe Police Department define de-escalation?
So I'll take this one. So knowing that this, definition, again, just like de-escalation, right, is dynamic, and we're still working on kind of finalizing how it will be defined in the department. But as of today, it's defined as techniques used to gain compliance with the goal of reducing violence or aggression. This can be accomplished through the application of the patrol model. And I will say that the patrol model is actually the foundation of the training, and each letter has meaning, which I'm happy to discuss offline. Communication, the use of appropriate force and or other reasonable techniques. Officers should not compromise their safety or increase the risk of physical harm to the public when applying de-escalation techniques. So that, as of today, is kind of what the department has defined as de-escalation.
Great. And our next question is for our third presenter. Again, I'm so sorry I had to cut you off, and if we have a little time, maybe we can go back. But one of the questions we have here for you, Sarah, is do you think focusing solely on the police is enough for reform?
I think that's a great question. I think that's what's happening right now in municipal settings, is trying to figure that out. And I think absolutely not. For substantial and necessary reforms, we need to add a broader range of stakeholders with a broader range of training. I think the most interesting thing right now is trying to figure out whether police can we can build a better cop, right? Police can be trained away from their worst impulses and be trained into sort of leaning into their better angels. And I think, that's certainly part of it. But the question remains, if there's an acknowledgement that there are these deep-seated entrenched racial and ethnic inequities connected to stratification that lead to conditions for criminal behavior in the first place, then what is the responsibility of local governance to address those as part and parcel with their response to crime and disorder? And so I think what's really interesting is in the 2018 interviews I did, there was a lot of focus on coordinating and collaborating with non-law enforcement actors, but the locus of control remained with the police department. And I think what will be really interesting in the next few years is to see how much decentralization we see and how much co-sharing of decision-making and power ends up happening in those local contexts as well.
And if you want to take this time to go ahead and talk about that last slide, I think we have a couple more minutes in here if you want to.
Oh, sure. Yes. And my apologies. I'm used to ASC where you get the 12 minutes. So
well, we got a little bit of time. So like I said, I always.
Sure. Yeah. So I think just, to round things out, I mean, these interviews were done with folks that were proudly progressives leading in cities that had Democratic leadership. And still in these progressive strongholds, the concept or the notion of defunding, I think it's important to recognize how nascent it is, because just 2 years ago, nobody was talking about defunding in the interviews that I did. So there is this idea that the momentum that has happened since George Floyd's death has really helped propel arguments towards having smaller force sizes, having less police officers on the ground, and also just having a larger footprint of social service agencies. And so I think what's most interesting moving forward is trying to figure out what are the reasons why there was so much coalescing around a similar approach among these folks that had very different trajectories with respect to the evolution of their legislative language, their legal language, and their policing ordinances in general in their cities, but still coalesced very strongly around this clear community policing reform narrative 2 years ago. And then what has caused those places, or what factors have contributed to those places taking very divergent approaches now. And so that will be something that will be interesting to explore. And I'm really interested in digging into that a bit more, and to also see how politically viable or sustainable these recently articulated, ideas at attempting to reallocate resources and priorities will be. And then of course, if those folks that I interviewed are still available, I would love to follow up with them if they are working or not so working in local governments, and sort of get their retrospective thoughts on where they were at in terms of municipal leadership a couple of years ago, and how things have shifted and why. So that's kind of what's on the horizon. Thanks for the extra minute. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have one last question. This is for Vrishali. Do you have any thoughts on what organizations could do to minimize cynicism in their members that might help to minimize the subsequent issues?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing would be teaching officers to recognize cynicism in themselves and in their peers. Once they, know what they're looking for, what they're experiencing, they can put a word to, the feelings they're having. Then departments can look at actual concrete ways of, if you're feeling this way, try doing this thing. But the first steps would be recognizing cynicism instead of saying, oh, that's just a normal feeling. Like, this is,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, great. If there's no other questions, I do want to just say thank you very much to our panelists. Your presentations were very well done and very interesting. I like that we had lots of questions here at the end. Thank you to the participants. We really appreciate you coming out for this conference. We know that a lot of our conferences have now been canceled, even through next year. So we're very excited that we were able to host this and get so much variety of so much great research and bring it to you all. So we really appreciate that. I'm sure you can reach out if you want to jot down the names last minute for anyone here and reach out to them at their universities. The chat is still open. I'll leave it open for another minute, and then I'll end the meeting. And thank you all for coming today.